Good morning and welcome to Gŵyl Day 2. I hope you enjoyed yesterday, and today we have a double whammy for you that I'm very excited about. But first, I wanted to mention that I had a little bit of feedback from B last night about Jemima's talk, and B said that when Murakami was originally translated, Norwegian Wood was translated as Tokyo Blues because Ryu Murakami, who wrote Tokyo Decadence, was really famous, and Haruki Murakami wasn't known at all at that point. So there's quite a lot of confusion and belief that the two books are linked and that the authors are the same. So another fun translation fact for you. Today we are going to be talking to Maddie from Pairini Press and to Robin Myers, who is a translator and poet based in Mexico City. So very excited about both of these. With Maddie, I want to talk a little bit about Pairini before we get started. Pairini Press is a small press based in the UK that publishes only novellas. They do some incredible books. In particular, my two favourites are The Muscle Feast and Snow Dog Foot. As of current two favourites. I do have Snow Dog Foot. I don't have The Muscle Feast with me at the moment because it is on loan. Looking at you, Lucy Whitehouse, but that is quite alright because she's loving it, and she said it was one of the best books she's read recently, which I entirely agree with. I do have it. It took me ages to find this morning because I couldn't remember what was on the front. I was going round all the chalkboards. But that's what The Muscle Feast looks like. Snow Dog Foot, and then we also have Snow Dog Foot up here. I'm going to be talking a lot about Snow Dog Foot later in the week when I interview Jay Ockenden, the translator of the book, so I'm going to save that for now. I just want to talk a little bit about The Muscle Feast, which is all one monologue, you could say. Not really, but it's all sort of, it's only 100 pages long. You race through it, and it's this all happens in one day, and it's this scene around a family missing one member, who are noise. I'm sure maybe you can't hear it. Who are waiting and eating mussels. And it symbolises, there's something in this I think really for everyone. I think it's a very good capturing of family dynamics, and I also think that this isn't a think, I know, that there are many parallels in it. So it was written just before the Berlin Wall fell, and it was intentionally an allegory for some extent to the political situation at the time. I didn't get that at all when I first read it, but I still loved it. I still loved it for everything else. But once you realise that, there's a whole another dimension on which to enjoy it as well. I love Pairini Press for having publishing novellas. I think that the novella is some of the most perfect pieces of writing I've ever read have been novellas. There is something in it that I think is crucial to writing, and it's the sort of brevity and the capturing the capturing of a spirit and a moment in time. So I really love what Pairini do, and I hope you find that this interview very interesting. So welcome everybody. This is Maddie Rogers from Buren Press, who is a publishing assistant there, and she is also, very importantly, the host of the Borderless Book Club, and it's all her hard work that has made it possible. So I welcome Maddie.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, Caitlin. Not at all, not at all. So do you want to tell us all a little bit about Perrier Press? Because Pyrini. Oh, I did that for so long. Oh no, rookie. I'm unprofessional already.
It's fine. Well, the first thing about Pyrini Press is that it has a name that is both difficult to spell and pronounce. So don't worry, you're not the only one who has trouble with it. Yeah, so Pyrini, we're like a very small independent publishing house. We specialize in contemporary European novellas. So all of our books, the concept of it is that you can read one of our books in the same time that it takes to watch film. So they're all short, sort of like you can read it in one sitting kind of thing. And we publish 3 books a year, most years, in like a series with a unifying theme. And we've published from, I think, 15 different European languages now. So we don't have like a specific focus, but yeah, we try and include lots of different literatures and cultures in our editorial. So yeah, this year we've got an Italian one, Snowdog Foot, which was we did in our book club last time.
Good.
Yeah, it's like the Snowdog Foot is like the first book that I worked on, so it's like one of my favorites. And then the one we've just had out to our subscribers this month, very recently, and will be out for general release in June, is Ankomst, which is Norwegian, and then the third one in our series this year is Georgian, to Pearfield. Yeah, so
that answers a question I was about to have, because my impression was it was mostly European, but a little bit wider, is it?
Yeah, I think we've done almost exclusively European, but it's not like it's not like it's a restriction on the books that we choose to publish. So we've published a Libyan novel before, and as I say, this Georgian one, and then next year we've got a Chilean one coming up. So we're trying to branch out a little bit from Europe, yeah. But as I say, most of our books are European.
So what was your experience like working on Snowdog Foot?
I love Snowdog Foot. So yeah, it was. I actually only joined Pyrini in December last year, so quite recently, and it was just going. I remember it had just gone out to subscribers when I joined. So I sort of did the PR for it as it was like being released, and sort of did all the social media and stuff. So that was really fun because it's a book that I really enjoy, so it was very easy to promote it. And it was also it was also really interesting because as we discussed in our book club meeting, it was translated by Jay Ockenden, who was the winner of the first Pyrini Stevens Translation Prize, which for me, because I haven't done any professional translation, but I just did finish an MA in translation studies. Like I come into it with the perspective of the translator as well. So for me, it was really interesting to see this scheme that was so perfect for debut translators to support people who hadn't done literary translation before. So yeah, I was really pleased to be able to work on that publication.
Yeah, I was quite like impressed when I found out that it was their first book that they've ever translated. Like it's so good. I really
did a really good job on it. It's very impressive. Yeah.
I really love the prose style. So how did you come to set up the Borderless Book Club? Because I actually found out about it through either Charco or Tilted Access. Like I was on one of their mailing lists. So how did it come about?
Yeah, so with that, it was started in March, and it was, I think, it was like the week that lockdown was either had just been announced or was really just about to be announced. Like we knew this was happening, like we were all going to have to stay inside, like we knew it was the last week we were going to be in the office for a while, and we were just thinking in the office. So as I said, Pyrini is very small. That day in the office there was me and Stella, who's the manager of Pyrini, and day to day it's just the two of us. And then there's also Micah Ziervogel, who's the founding publisher of Pyrini. She's a bit more hands-off these days, but because she was living in Lebanon and working in a refugee camp, but then she had to come back because of coronavirus, so we kind of knew, right, this is a bit of a strange situation. So she was also in the office, and she was talking about how with I think with her mother and her children, they were doing like a family Zoom book club, and she was like, oh, this is such a nice idea that we all get together on Zoom and we discuss this book. And she was saying to us, you should really find some sort of like social media engagement that you can do with our readers during this time. Like this would be a good time to think of something a bit creative. So we were thinking, and we were saying, well, the book club thing sounds really nice. Maybe we could do a Pyrini book club, and talk about our books with our readers. I think it was Stella who said, well, we could get some other presses involved. Like we could reach out to some other presses. But then she said, I'm quite busy. So Maddie, can you do this? Like, do you think you could look into this? And I was like, yeah, let's do it. So I got in touch with the other 5 presses that we had the initial sort of run with. So Charco, Tilted Axis, Nordisk, Istros, and Comma. I emailed them all, just called them all up and said, what do you think about this idea? And they were like, yeah, it sounds good. We'd like to be involved. So we sort of got the group together and put our first meeting together really quickly. I mean really quickly. Like we got it organized in about 5 days, which is kind of crazy actually when you think about it. And yeah, I emailed Jamie Bullock, the translator of the Muscle Feast, and said, because that wasn't actually necessarily the original sort of gimmick, if gimmick's the right word, that we were going for. Gimmick isn't the right word, but like the sort of unique selling point of having the translators involved in the discussion wasn't actually really the focus of the first meetings we had about it. It was more just like we should talk about our books and get our readers involved. It wasn't until I'd kind of thought about how I was going to host the first meeting, and we'd said, because we've worked with Jamie a lot, he's translated lots of our books, and he's, as you will know if you've seen or listened to the first meeting of the book club, he's very eloquent and a really great guest to have. So they said, why don't you get Jamie involved? So I did, and then that went so well that I thought, well, we should really be including the translators, because this is actually a great opportunity to have those discussions with the translators. So that's basically how it happened.
That's really interesting to hear the sort of like behind the scenes.
Yeah.
I have to say that Muscle Feast and Snow Dog Fit are the two, probably those two, and Where the Wild Ladies are the ones that I've been like recommending. And I just lent Muscle Feast to a friend the other day, and she was like, this is the best book I've ever read.
Oh,
so
wow.
I think there's something really, really special going on there.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so yesterday's book club was about Arid Dreams, and I was quite curious as to what your opinion of Arid Dreams was, and like your sort of behind the scenes, if you got to like be sort of chatting about it in one of the breakout rooms, what you would say, because my breakout room was quite interesting. I really, really loved the book, and everyone generally had enjoyed reading it, but the sort of reaction to how like sometimes difficult the male characters can be to read actually I think created quite a lot of like resistance, and like which I really feel like some people just found it so unpleasant to read that it was turning them off slightly. So I was wondering what you thought about Arid Dreams.
Well, yeah, it's really interesting of you to ask me, because I feel like actually most of the time in the book club I try not to offer too much of my own opinions, and and it's something that I've had to think about quite a lot. It's how much I want to put in my own thoughts, and I think I try and respond to what's being said, but I try not to take over too much with my own ideas. But this thing of, where when we have these books which have these difficult men in them, and these narratives that show these unpleasant male characters, and those kinds of narratives always seem to be the ones that do cause the most what's the word, the most sort of tension and conflict of opinion. And we saw it with our Nordisk book Restless. That was the one that had this really quite divisive male narrator, and there was a lot of talk about unpleasant male characters and stuff. And I don't think it's maybe wise to compare these two authors necessarily, but it is interesting to see how this happens. And with Arid Dreams, I just thought that, and I think I did say this yesterday, that a lot of these male characters are not presented in a sympathetic way at all, and they come across as very pathetic. And I mean, when I read it, I didn't think that I was put off by that at all, actually. I thought there was a lot of humor in the way that these men were presented, like and the way that they're sort of ideas and their pride about their masculinity was sort of exposed as being quite ridiculous. You know, there's that short one with the letter from the inmate, and he's like, you must find this woman and tell her this really important thing. It's so important that you find her and tell her that the story I told her about my penis being chopped off by my wife was a lie. Like, imagine you're about to be executed and that's your top of your priorities. I thought it was really funny. I thought it was hilarious.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I didn't find that put me off the book at all. No, I really enjoyed it, actually. I enjoyed a lot, actually, that the stories were quite different. That I think sometimes people with a short story would want like to feel like they were connected, or like there was some kind of cohesive style to them, and I didn't really feel that with Arid Dreams. I felt like it was kind of maybe a little disjointed, but I liked that about it. I liked that the styles differed and that you never knew what you were going to get. I think I think it might have been you actually, who described it as like Thai short stories that throw curveballs at you. And yeah, that's absolutely how it felt. Like you didn't know if it was going to be funny, if it was going to be scary, if it was going to be really sort of like poetic and lovely. So yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, funnily enough, I think it made so much sense when it came out last night that the stories were taken from different collections, that they hadn't originally been written as one chunk. They like, some of them were as old as 1995, so I thought that was really relevant. And also to the sort of Nordisk, I was thinking about the Nordisk book. I came on with Arid Dreams, I loved it. With the Nordisk one, I did not. I think it's quite interesting to think about the two, that there was something in the Nordisk one called Restless by Kenneth Moe that I couldn't get behind the narrator, but there was something in Arid Dreams that I thought was very valuable. Yeah.
I think the interesting thing with Restless is that I probably had a similar feeling to it when I read it, that I didn't necessarily enjoy the experience of reading it, and I felt, yeah, I didn't like the character. I didn't really like sort of the stuff that he was saying, but that said, it's the one that I've thought about the most afterwards. Like, I've spent so much time thinking about that book, and actually the more I think about it, the more I think that it's very clever in how it does that. I think that it is the intention is that you're not supposed to like it, and it has this whole thing running through it about literature and trying to find something that will cure you of literature. And that book really made me think about what I want to get from the reading experience and what the point of the reading experience is, and whether, you know, a book, what makes us decide to read anything, and what makes a book worth reading. So it actually made me think about my own reading habits a lot more than probably any of the others have. So yeah, it was an interesting one, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. I really like everything you just said, and I definitely think that all of that can be gained from the book. I guess my feeling when reading it was, would a woman writing about, or especially a woman or person of colour writing about the same sort of experience and feelings of basically teenage sexuality and teenage angst, would they get the chance? I think I maybe would have liked it more if like it was exactly the same book, but I don't know, there were elements of sexism you couldn't just directly do.
Yeah.
I feel like other people maybe wouldn't get to write that book.
Yeah, and that's something we talked about when we said, you know, would a woman get the space to write this book? And I think I said, I don't think a woman would write this book. So, you know, yeah, it's a hard question, really. But I think you can talk about like the space that writers are afforded to you know, to explore certain themes, but that's not necessarily so pertinent to the book itself, if that makes sense. Like, you can talk about why this book was published and not another book, but that's probably a different discussion to what is the merit of this book, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, very wisely put. So I have some of the next books coming up right here.
Exciting.
Are there any in particular that you're looking forwards to?
I'm looking forward to all of them, and I say that like without any, you know, attempt at avoiding the question. Like, I genuinely do look forward to every single one. And actually, part of the thing that's been so great for me doing this is that I get to read all these books, and that I'm often in the position of reading a book that comes from a language or a culture that I've never explored before, and that is great for me. Like, it was true yesterday with the Thai book. Like, I'd never read anything from Thailand before, I'd never read anything from Sudan before, and we did 13 Months of Sunrise. Like, it's really broadening my own horizons, and I really enjoy that about it. And I think it's also quite good for me as the host to have that position as well, because I don't I was actually saying this to Mui yesterday before we began the conversation, of like, I do sometimes ask questions that are maybe a bit basic, or like, you know, perhaps don't go as deep as they could, but that's because I'm in this position, which is the same as a lot of our readers, that, you know, we don't know anything about this culture or this literature. So it's quite good, I think, for me to be in that position. So yeah, I mean, I actually have Summer of Reckoning right next to me because I'm reading it at the moment. So yeah, I'm really enjoying this one currently, but I couldn't just pick one out, because I do look forward to all of them, and they're all very different. So
yeah, I'm particularly looking forward to the Palestinian plus 100. I think I would have bought this one anyway, even if it hadn't been. For those of you who don't know, it's Nakba plus 100 years. So it's a set of Palestinian short stories that aren't to do with the current situation in Palestine. So that looks really exciting.
Yeah, I am looking forward to that one. And I have to say, like, I probably do mostly look forward to the ones that are outside of my previous sort of knowledge or experience, and that's definitely true of the Palestine one. I'm trying to go through the ones that we've got coming up. So yeah, that I'm looking forward to Holiday Heart as well, the next one that we've got.
That one hasn't arrived yet. I know, I'm so excited.
It hasn't arrived for me yet either. Charco were kind enough to send me Fish Soup, which I've slightly dabbled in. I don't think I've fully read any of the next ones that are coming up, unfortunately. It is like quite a lot for me of like reading one after the other. So and I have the same issue actually as everybody else. Everyone emails me on a weekly basis saying, I haven't got the book yet. And sometimes I'm like, me neither. We're all at the mercy of Royal Mail currently. So yeah, but I'm really looking forward to all of the ones that we've got coming up.
Me too. Thank you so much, Maddie. It was really, really lovely to speak to you. And everybody, come check her out. Check out Parini Press, and please come join the Borderless Book Club. Can vouch, it's really, really enjoyable.
Thank you, Pauline.
Part 2 of tonight's programming is the translator and poet from Mexico City, or calling in from Mexico City, Robin Myers. It was a really joy to get to know her, and we talked a little bit about fiction and poetry, and the differences between translating the two. We talked about her latest 2 books that have just been published, and they sound excellent. I will be buying both of them. And we also chatted a little bit about the US translated market, about her partnership with Gŵyl. I hope that's saying it right. And yeah, it was a really, really interesting interview, and I also am really glad that to explore poetry and the translation of poetry a little bit. I think she had some really insightful things to say about it. Yeah, this one. She translated this book.
There we are. Hello everybody, and welcome back to another evening with Gŵyl Festival, a festival for all things in translation. I am incredibly honoured to be joined this evening by Robin Myers, calling in from Mexico City. Robin Myers is a Mexico City-based translator and poet. She's published several books, or that she's translated for. You translate mostly from Spanish to English, exclusively that direction?
Exclusively. Mm-hmm.
Her books include Manca, Animals at the End of the World, and Cars on Fire. I came across Robin Myers through her translation of Gŵyl Zedenwerg's lyric Poetry is Dead, which I really, really enjoyed. And yeah, thank you so much for coming and talking to me.
Thank you, Caitlin. It's such a pleasure.
So how did you get involved in translation? Was languages something that you excelled at from a young age? Yeah, how did you settle on it as a career?
I'd say there are sort of two main currents there. One of them is that I've always loved poetry and began writing poetry fairly young. And I was studying Spanish and have a family connection to Mexico. One of my paternal grandmother was from Mexico. So I had also sort of around the same time as I was starting to write poetry, I was developing this real fascination with Mexico. I'd come a bunch of times as a child, and I desperately wanted to become fluent in Spanish so that I could spend more time in Mexico. And so there was a sort of interweaving of these two areas that I felt passionate about. I wanted to write poetry. I wanted to learn more about specifically Mexican poetry at first, and then more broadly Latin American poetry. And as I got older and continued to study both of those things, at a certain point, I ended up moving to Mexico. I had already been translating poetry out of love and curiosity. I felt it was a way, in the way that translation itself is this intense, close reading, and kind of an assimilation within a certain text. I was exploring that on my own. And in a way, when I moved to Mexico, which was about 9 years ago, I came sort of without a ways to start making a living. And it seemed that translation was both something, I sort of stumbled into it in a way that felt I was pulled, and I was also improvising. And I started translating prose as well, which is now sort of the bulk of how I make my living. But it felt like a series of sort of happy accidents, as many things are.
So you translate both prose and poetry, and one of the things that I've noticed in my own reading is that I have a lot less translated poetry, or did before I started seeking it out really intentionally. And do you think there's a gap in the industry there? Do you think it's some of the nature of poetry that poetry is harder to translate because it's so often can more center around wordplay, and also the poetry industry itself receives so much less funding, and also, yeah, do you find one easier to translate, harder to translate?
Those are such great interlocking questions. I think as far as the gap, I do feel that way. I think some of it is what I see as still this divide between the prose world and the poetry world, period. I think it's something I've noticed in the States. I've noticed it in Mexico too. I think particularly there's this idea that poets read poetry and fiction writers read fiction. And there is certainly much more crossover than I think is actually talked about or acknowledged. But there's still, I think poetry is still in this sort of odd position where it's seen as, which it makes me sad. I don't think it has to be that way, but is seen as somehow more accessible. And the reality, of course, is that there is never any money in poetry. And so I think that market-wise is a reality that, then gets to be grappled with. I think that also just in terms of the publishing market, whereas many prose works are translated when there is a contract for them already in place. And poetry, I think the expectation almost across the board is that you have to translate the entire book and then send it out, and good luck to you. And so I think there's that, I think, is a factor too. I don't think that poetry is inherently more difficult to translate. I do think it requires I don't think also, I'm not of the camp that thinks that only poets can or should translate poetry, but I do think you have to read a lot of poetry, because poetry does, I think, on a formal level, depending on the poem and the poet, on a level of sound. And in so many ways, I think there are kind of tactile issues that you need to pay attention to in poetry that come within a form that is already in place, within some sort of structure. And so I don't think that that's impenetrably difficult, but it is a specific set of challenges. I think for me, when I started translating, I translated almost entirely poetry. And I found when I started translating prose that there were all sorts of other challenges about how to sort of respect the form and respect the shape and respect the register. But it often felt very exhilarating, like it was this sense of, I don't know what the metaphor would be, but it was a different sort of dance, I guess. But I think that in starting by translating poetry, there was a sort of obsession with what language physically does on the page, which I think is very translatable to the translation of prose. So I really enjoyed sort of making my transition in that way. But I do think, just back to your initial question, that yes, I think it is that it's such a leap of faith for everyone involved, including editors and publishers, to publish translation, that they often, I think, unless it's an extremely established poet, a poet that people already sort of have in their head, it's harder, but it is a labor of love for sure.
If you like, I think if we go to like specifically your two most latest books, Animals at the End of the World and Cars on Fire. So Cars on Fire is a set of short stories that sound amazing. And then Animals at the End of the World is am I right in saying, so it's based on there's a 6-year-old girl as the central character. So is it a children's book?
No,
No,
and I think that's,
yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
Please tell me more about that.
Thank you. Animals at the End of the World it's a coming of age story in which the narrator, in a very subtle way, is a grown woman, and she is recalling the narrator's childhood as a 6-year-old. But most of the book, entirely actually, the book takes place sort of through the perspective of that child she's growing up in the 1980s in Bogota, and living with her mother and her mother's parents. And it's sort of her coming into an awareness both of the truly toxic family dynamics going on in her household, and then also the sense of class barriers. And she embarks on this very sort of fateful, intense friendship with the daughter of the family's housekeeper. And so it's this very careful study of this very young child's sort of grappling with these extremely adult forces around her, with ultimately really painful consequences. And Cars at the End of the World is by just to mention, that's by the Colombian writer Gloria Susana Esquivel. And the book that you also mentioned, Cars on Fire, is by the Chilean writer Mónica Ramón Ríos. And that's a set of short stories that take many, many different forms and use the voice of many different narrators, usually women, usually immigrants from Chile to the United States, or women who are in Chile. And it's this wild, kinetic, I think of it fundamentally as a book of protest about the ways that neoliberalism and the patriarchy and sort of scripts about how women and artists who are women are supposed to confine themselves and refuse to, and find freedom both in creativity and in sexuality and desire and in love.
I checked, and both books are available for purchase in the UK.
Yes.
So
that's wonderful.
If anyone is interested, just give it a Google. You'll be able to find it at most major retailers.
Thank you, Caitlin.
They sound so wonderful. Were there any particular challenges with either of them in translation?
I would say in the case of Animals at the End of the World, the voice, I think, is when people use that phrase, deceptively simple. There is a sense of childlike wonder or innocence in many ways, and yet there's also this extremely, on the part of the author, an incredible carefulness in the way that she introduces these sort of forces of violence and of desire also. And I think it's as a writer, that's such a challenge to achieve both of those things at the same time, to sort of introduce all of these complexities in a way that doesn't sound either overly cute in the voice of a child or sort of overly adult. And I think I admired that so much in what Gloria Susana had been able to do, and that was a challenge in English that was an exciting challenge. And in the case of Cars on Fire, I think Monica's book has been described several times as uncompromising, which I think is always an interesting word. And part of what for me that meant is that she often plunges the reader into situations that are already very strange, and there's really no attempt. She's not, I think, especially interested in sort of explaining why they're strange. That's the starting point, and it's the sort of the reader, it's an act of faith on the part of the reader, and there's an accompaniment, I think, into the sort of the realm that is already transformed. And so some of that for me was about how to establish the terms, you know, to respect the terms really of what she was and was not elaborating on, and yet also to guide the reader to, you know, to sort of achieve that balance between clarity and an intentional disorientation, which is ultimately very beautiful. So I would say that about Cars on Fire.
Wow. Both of them were published with American publishers.
Yes.
And we're obviously based in the UK, and I have some knowledge of the UK translated fiction presses and industry. What's the American one like? And I know that you're working both with the US and with bilingual translators in Mexico City. What's your impression of the market, and who do you like? Who would you recommend to look at?
You know, it's really only in the last few years that I had started working actually more with bilingual presses in Mexico, and then more recently with presses in the US. And so I'm also still getting, I mean, I'm sort of observing as a reader and as someone who's really interested in the panorama. My specific experiences have still been, you know, fairly limited and are starting to expand. But I'd say, I mean, to use the case of Open Letter, for instance, which is a press based in Rochester, New York, that translate the poet's only literature in translation, and they were among the first independent presses to do that. And they've also been, I think, real pioneers in presenting the extraordinary lack of translated literature in the US. And the famous quote is 3% of everything that's published in the United States is literature and translation. And so part of an active effort to bring translation into greater contact with American readership. So I feel very honored to have worked with them and to continue to work with them. I think what's exciting is that in recent years, there are more and more really brave, amazing, committed independent presses that are either publishing also only translation or are making much more of a priority to do so. And just to name a few, because there are quite a few at this point, I would say Deep Vellum, which is based in Texas, Transit Books, which is in California, New Vessel, which is in New York. And so, yeah, I think there's a growing sense that this is that there's support also among, like, these presses are supporting each other, which I think is also essential and wonderful. University of Texas Press, I think, is another really interesting example, and one that's often maybe overlooked, and I hope continues to get more attention, and that they're primarily an academic press, and they're well known as publishing academic books, but they have this growing, really remarkable collection of novels from Latin America, and so they're you know, in the process of expanding that, which I think is very, very exciting. So I'd say that, sorry?
Oh no, I was just gonna say, I just bought a book from them.
Oh, you did? Oh, great.
Yeah, Nelly Campobello, Patuccio.
Yeah. They're publishing such an exciting range of things too, and I think also contemporary writers and not, like in the case of Nelly Campobello. So I'm very encouraged by that. So yeah, I mean, I think that is something that I find really exciting and inspiring. I mean, the panorama is difficult, and we all know that, you know, this is not an easy market in any size of press, and in any time. And I think particularly right now, you know, independent presses and booksellers and everyone is getting hard hit. But I think both, I mean, the independent translation scene in the US is growing, and is also establishing really wonderful networks with booksellers and with other networks of people who are passionate about translation.
That's really exciting to hear. It's always exciting. Definitely, it parallels the UK in that these are all new presses. You know, your Tilted Press, Charco Press. We've worked with a little bit, doing what is it like being, you're a copy editor for Charco Press, so there you're editing someone else's translation.
Mhm.
What are there any sort of unexpected aspects of that? What's doing that like?
It's been a really fascinating experience. Charco has I think, a really cool policy, which is often pairing people who are translators themselves to edit the translations that have been done by someone else. And I think, copy editing is such an intense task, and I've done it some before, but I think the experience of being a translator, working with translators, it's been nothing but positive and rewarding for me, in part because everyone knows sort of what the other person is up against, and I think, given that Charco publishes translations from Spanish into English, which is exactly what I do, and other copy editors who often are Charco translators themselves. There's a sort of trading off, which I think is also lovely. You're able to consult the original text, you're able to go back and forth, but it's given me a lot of respect and admiration, even more than I had already, for several of the really amazing translators that they have in the catalog, and also a chance to think about sort of the act of translation with another degree of removal, and to think, sort of in sympathy with the challenges that each translator is facing. I've really, really enjoyed it.
Fantastic. I want to move on a little bit to your own poetry. So I did a little bit of Googling and discovered that you tend to write poetry, or you have written lots of poetry in characters. And I found a particular quote from a previous interview that I really liked, that was like essentially questioning why in fiction it's so accepted that the author is some degree removed from the characters. It's normally a character, the separation obviously is always interesting and up for question, whereas in poetry it's much less common. So I'm wondering what draws you to character poems?
I think, and many times when I have found myself in the situation of writing a character poem, it's because honestly I felt that I had come up against some sort of block, and that I was getting frustrated with my own habits, I'd say, and I was looking for some way to get myself on, in a way, in a technical level, to get somewhere that I was finding it difficult to get by myself. And of course, it's still yourself, it's still you. And yet sometimes I do think, in the way, I used it as a sort of prompt, in a sense, not that it was being imposed on me or asked of me, but just as a sort of way to jump into something new. I think also, I think of it more, and I don't have my thoughts very developed on this front, but you're helping me sort of venture an idea, which is that I think I've started to think about this in a different way now that I am a full-time translator. Like, I think there's something about the experience of inhabiting something that's both yours and not yours, that has made me think about writing in a very different way, and about the artifice of writing. And I think, that with poetry, in going back a little bit to what we were talking about at the beginning, there's still this sense of poetry as this sort of sacred vessel, which, in some ways, I'm obsessed with poetry. I think there is something sacred that happens there, but I do think also that there's still this very sort of romantic capital R idea that, the poet is sort of overcome with a need to express the depths of their soul, and that has to take the form of lived experience. And I'm just interested in complicating that, and in thinking about, how it is that we sort of invent structures for ourselves to think about. I had this teacher once who said something I think about all the time, which is that she actually said this to someone in the workshop, that if you're writing poems about your relationship with your father all the time, you can look out the window and see a pine tree and try to write a poem about the pine tree, and you will still find a way for it to be about what you need to talk about, and I think that was so liberating to me, in this idea that, we are sort of involving ourselves with ideas that help us to get where we need to go. And it doesn't have to be all about sort of sitting and looking at your feet or something, you know. You can go farther if you want to.
What a poetic way of putting it. Do you write poetry in English? Do you write poetry in Spanish? Like, do you write in both?
I write poetry still only in English, and I think that happens in part just because it's always, and this has become sort of, it's very clear to me as a translator too, is that, you know, the relationship, sort of the resources at your disposal in your first language. I didn't grow up speaking Spanish. It's different. It's a different relationship. You're more limited in a way, which can also be exciting, you know, to try to play with those limitations. But I think that especially in living in Mexico, living my everyday life in Spanish, when I write poetry, I really want to sort of know what I have to work with, which is also kind of a control freak thing to say. You know, I think increasingly, I mean, I have friends here who are from other places, but they've lived here forever. I'm speaking in particular about an Italian friend who writes in both Spanish and Italian, and his attitude is just that, you know, language is ours to play with. You know, we don't have to just sort of like, oh, I couldn't possibly, you know. And I think that's been a bit more of my stance, which is both a preference and a sort of anxiety response. But I have written some essays in Spanish and really enjoyed that. And I think maybe someday I will try to write poetry in Spanish, but it's, for the most part now, there has been that gap. And I've also been really fortunate to have my poetry in English translated, some of it into Spanish, by people that I've also collaborated with. And so I think also sort of out of respect and love for that process, yeah, I have tended to separate these things.
So you talk about collaboration, and obviously I know that the book that I found you through, Lit Poetry Instead, you and Ezekiel translate each other fairly frequently and seem to have a partnership. Is that unusual in sort of poetry translation, and what's that like?
I don't know how unusual it is. I think I know of many people who have, I mean, I think it's often more of a sort of long-standing relationship where one person translates the other, and there are other forms of collaboration or co-translation even. I can say, just speaking from this experience of mine, that it has been unusual. I mean, it's the only sort of friendship collaboration I have of exactly this nature. We've known each other for a long time. I studied translation with him in Buenos Aires when I was a student there briefly, and it's been a sort of a transformative experience for me, both in the sense that I learned and still learn an enormous amount from his vast knowledge of translation and of Latin American poetry, but also now in the sense of being able to sort of, I mean, in each case, when I translate him or when he translates me, the person who's translating does an initial version and then sort of shows it to the other person, who then makes comments. But it is certainly a continual conversation, which for me has been extremely rewarding and fun.
That sounds, that's really interesting to learn about. Are you working on any poetry at the moment? Are you working on a translation at the moment? What's your current work?
All of the above. One project which has been in the works for a long time and is in sort of final phases, it'll be out in the fall, is a book that's sort of an academic book, but also not entirely, by the Mexican writer Cristina Rivera Garza. And it's a book of essays called The Restless Dead. And that is coming out with Vanderbilt University Press in the US. And then I'm working on a bunch of, this time I'll talk specifically about poetry, a few things that I'm really excited about. There's a book of poems by the Mexican poet Isabel Zapata, which is a beautiful book of poems almost entirely about animals and the natural world, called A Whale is a Country. And that's, none of these projects that I'm talking about have publishers yet, but are sort of in the process. And I'm working on two Argentine poets, both very young and amazing. One is named Mariana Espada, and the other is named Daniel Lipara. And so it's been, especially in these very oddest of times, it's been a sense of a real kind of practice for me to be translating some poetry every day and just having that as a sort of constant companionship.
Do you do it in a quiet place? Do you have to really focus? Do you like, I know that sounds maybe like a, but I'm really interested in the practice of translation. Does it sort of feel similar to the practice of writing?
It feels like the practice of writing, but already being directed towards something. It's like a sort of, yeah, like there's already sort of an invitation you're responding to. It feels similar to me also. I mean, in just thinking even just about like work conditions, I find that if I'm writing, if I'm translating, not poetry actually, but if I'm translating prose, I often can listen to music even. But sometimes, yeah, I do need a sort of sense. I can work sort of with things happening around me, but there is a sense of a very intense focus. But before our current pandemic reality, I often did like to go and work in coffee shops and have sort of human noise around me. I've always found that very comforting. But I live in Mexico City, which is a loud place, so there's plenty of that even at a distance.
And lastly, to wrap up, do you have any books that are from Spanish translation into English that you would recommend people searching out that maybe they haven't? I know I've put you on the spot here.
No.
That maybe people haven't come across, or even better, if you had a poetry recommendation or two, that would be wonderful.
Yes, I have. The first two that come to mind are actually, there are three that are prose, and they're all by Mexican writers. There's one which is a novel called The Mutations, by Jorge Comensal, that was translated by Charlotte Whittle, which is wonderful. And then there are two with the same translator, who is an astonishing, actually Charlotte's also an astonishing British translation, they both are, but by Sophie Hughes, a very recent translator called, recent translation called Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor, which is absolutely extraordinary. Do you have it?
It's just in the corner over there on my
it's so amazing. It's so amazing. And the other is, go ahead, sorry, there's a bit of a delay.
She's also translated an Orphan World by Charco Press, didn't she? Is that
Yeah.
right? Yes.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And I was going to mention another book also translated by Sophie that is a few years older, but I think is just exquisite. It's beautiful, beautiful book called Umami, by Laia Fresa. And that's also Sophie's translation. And what I had a poetry recommendation that was on the tip of my tongue, and I forgot. I'm sorry. I had the Zoom freeze.
Not at all. If you remember, I'll write it in so that people can find it later.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Robin. That was the most interesting conversation.
Thank you, Caitlin. It's been such a joy. Thank you so much for your questions and your openness and your support of all of these arts that converge in translation.
The least I can do. Yeah, so anyway, thanks guys for listening, and tune in for the next, not sure which night this is coming out on, but I bet tomorrow is really good.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for watching day 2. I think that these two interviews really complemented each other, and they're both incredible women. So thank you very much to both Robin and Maddie for chatting to me, and we'll see you all again tomorrow.